Imagine waking up to see a wall of fire floating directly toward your ship in the dead of night. It is August 8, 1588, off the coast of Gravelines. You are aboard the most feared war machine the world has ever seen, the supposedly invincible Spanish Armada. But right now, absolute panic is tearing through the ranks. Anchor cables are being frantically hacked apart. Massive, heavily armed galleons are violently crashing into one another in the pitch black. The world's greatest superpower is breaking formation and fleeing for its life from an underdog island nation they were supposed to conquer in a matter of weeks. For centuries, we have been fed a very specific myth about this exact moment: that a brilliant, scrappy English navy, guided by the genius of Queen Elizabeth I and the daring of Sir Francis Drake, effortlessly outsmarted King Philip II's slow, clumsy Spanish fleet. We are told it was a miraculous victory of superior tactics and Protestant wind that instantly birthed the global British Empire. But that is not the whole truth. In fact, it misses the most crucial, shocking details of the entire Anglo-Spanish War. The real story of how England toppled the absolute apex of the Spanish Golden Age involves disastrous intelligence failures, extreme religious paranoia, and a secret war of state-sponsored piracy that drove two monarchs to the brink of financial ruin. The Spanish Armada didn't just fail because of bad weather or a few clever fire ships. It was doomed by a single, catastrophic, strategic miscalculation made months before a single sail was ever hoisted. A fatal flaw that King Philip was explicitly warned about, but chose to ignore. And the truth is, the English almost lost it all in the immediate aftermath, suffering a disaster nearly as massive as the Armada itself. So, what actually happened when the two most powerful rulers on Earth collided for control of the seas? And what was the devastating secret that truly broke the back of the invincible empire? To understand the sheer magnitude of what happened in the pitch black off Gravelines, we first have to strip away centuries of British propaganda and look at the terrifying reality of the geopolitical chessboard in the late 16th century. If you look at a map from the 1580s, the idea of England defeating Spain is roughly equivalent to a local high school football team trying to take down a combined roster of NFL All-Stars. King Philip II of Spain didn't just rule a country, he commanded the first truly global empire in human history. Silver and gold from the Americas were pouring into his treasury by the galleon load. He controlled Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and vast resource-rich territories across the New World. His armies, particularly the elite Spanish tercios, were universally considered invincible on the battlefield. England, on the other hand, was a geopolitical afterthought. Queen Elizabeth I was sitting on a nearly bankrupt throne, ruling over a deeply fractured, culturally isolated island. Her nation was violently torn apart by religious extremism, oscillating bloodily between Catholicism and Protestantism for decades. To make matters worse, the Pope had officially excommunicated Elizabeth, essentially putting a holy bounty on her head and framing her assassination as a divine duty. Plots to murder her were being uncovered constantly, many of them bankrolled directly by Philip's ambassadors. Elizabeth wasn't fighting for global dominance. She was fighting for basic daily survival. Every single morning she woke up, a very real sword of Damocles hung over her neck. Because England couldn't possibly afford a massive standing army or a conventional navy to match Spain's sprawling armada, Elizabeth had to get creative. And by creative, I mean she turned to organized crime. She began secretly funding a network of ruthless privateers, the legendary Sea Dogs, men like John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake. History books often paint Francis Drake as a dashing, swashbuckling hero of the realm. But to the Spanish, and frankly by the standards of modern international law, Drake was a bloodthirsty, state-sponsored terrorist. He was intercepting Spanish treasure fleets, looting colonial ports in the Americas, and practically burning his way across the Pacific. He was running a mafia-style shakedown of the global economy, and Elizabeth, she publicly condemned his actions to the Spanish ambassadors while privately taking a massive, under-the-table cut of the loot. In fact, the plunder from Drake's infamous circumnavigation of the globe paid off England's entire national debt, with enough left over to fund the crown for a full year. This shadow war bled the Spanish economy dry and humiliated Philip on the world stage. But the final straw snapped in 1587, when Elizabeth ordered the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic royal whom Philip saw as the rightful, legitimate heir to the English throne. For the King of Spain, this was the ultimate provocation. It was no longer just about protecting his transatlantic trade routes. This was now a holy crusade. Philip unleashed the full, terrifying industrial might of his empire to build the Grande y Felicissima Armada, the great and most fortunate navy. The objective was mathematically simple: sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with a battle-hardened Spanish army of 30,000 men waiting in the Netherlands, cross the Channel on flat-bottomed barges, and march directly on London to depose the heretic queen. When news of this massive buildup reached London, absolute terror gripped the English populace. Warning beacons were constructed along the coastlines. Militias, armed with little more than pitchforks and old bows, prepared for an apocalyptic invasion they knew they could not win. The end of England felt inevitable. Now, the traditional narrative tells us that King Philip was a hubristic, out-of-touch tyrant, blinded by religious zeal, who sent his slow, lumbering ships blindly into English waters, completely underestimating the scrappy British resistance. We are told the Spanish Armada was doomed by sheer royal arrogance and a foolish underestimation of the enemy. But here is the massive historical lie that completely flips the script. Philip wasn't blind. He wasn't relying on faith alone, and he absolutely knew the English fleet was highly advanced and lethally dangerous. In fact, months before the Armada ever left port, Philip's own top naval commander, the seasoned and brilliant Admiral Santa Cruz, sat down and calculated the exact logistics required for a successful invasion. Santa Cruz sent Philip a highly classified, brutally honest report. It explicitly warned the king that unless he secured a deep-water port in the Netherlands for the Armada to safely dock and load the army, the entire fleet would be trapped in a fatal bottleneck, completely exposed to the superior long-range cannons of the English ships. Philip read the warning. He understood the profound tactical suicide of the plan. He knew he did not have the deep-water port his top admiral said was absolutely mandatory for survival. And then, he deliberately ordered the fleet to sail into the meat grinder anyway. Why did King Philip pull the trigger on a doomed plan? It wasn't just blind hubris. It was sheer, unadulterated desperation. Philip genuinely believed he was executing the will of God, assuming divine intervention would magically solve his massive logistical nightmare. But God didn't intervene. Instead, tragedy struck. Just months before the launch, Admiral Santa Cruz, the only man capable of pulling off this impossible mission, suddenly dropped dead. Panic set in. To replace his legendary naval commander, Philip appointed the Duke of Medina Sidonia. There was just one massive problem. The Duke had zero naval experience. In fact, he got violently seasick just stepping onto a boat. He wrote a desperate letter to the king, begging to be excused, claiming he was completely unfit to command a fleet. Philip ignored it. The seasick Duke was forced to take the helm. But here's the twist. Medina Sidonia wasn't the bumbling idiot history often portrays. He was a ruthless, brilliant administrator. In a matter of months, he whipped the chaotic, undersupplied armada into a highly disciplined fighting force. When the 130 ships finally appeared off the English coast in July 1588, they weren't a disorganized mess. They were locked into a massive, tightly packed crescent formation. It was a floating, heavily armored fortress. The English fleet sailed out to meet them, expecting their faster, more maneuverable ships to easily pick off the Spanish galleons. Sir Francis Drake and his captains unleashed broadside after broadside. The result? Absolutely nothing. The English cannonballs literally bounced off the thick oak hulls of the Spanish ships. The Armada absorbed the fire, maintained its ironclad formation, and kept pushing relentlessly up the English Channel. For a solid week, the English threw everything they had at the Armada. They barely left a scratch. The English commanders realized a terrifying truth. They couldn't stop them. The invincible fleet was going to reach the invasion point. Except they were sailing straight into the very trap the late Admiral Santa Cruz had warned about. On August 6th, the Armada dropped anchor off the coast of Calais, just miles from the Duke of Parma, and his 30,000 battle-hardened Spanish troops waiting in the Netherlands. They had made it. All they had to do was load the troops onto barges and sail across the channel. But 16th century communication was agonizingly slow. Parma didn't even know the Armada had arrived. His troops weren't ready. They needed at least 6 days to march to the coast and mobilize. 6 days. The Armada was parked in shallow water, completely exposed, without the deep water port Santa Cruz said was mandatory for survival. The English fleet was anchored just upwind, watching, waiting. The Spanish had walked right into the fatal bottleneck. The English knew their standard cannons were completely useless against the thick Spanish armor. So, they decided to change the rules of the game. They weren't going to sink the Armada. They were going to burn it alive. Just past midnight on August 8th, the tide shifted. The English took 8 of their own ships, packed them to the brim with pitch, brimstone, gunpowder, and loaded cannons. They set the decks on fire and let the wind and tide carry these floating bombs directly toward the tightly packed Spanish fleet. These weren't just normal fire ships. To the Spanish, these were hellburners. A few years earlier, the Spanish had faced similar explosive ships in Antwerp that literally blew hundreds of their troops to pieces. The psychological terror was absolute. When the Spanish sailors saw the walls of fire drifting toward them in the pitch black, all discipline evaporated. It was sheer, primal panic. Captains didn't even take the time to raise their massive anchors. They violently hacked the thick cables with axes, desperately trying to escape the flames. Heavy galleons blindly rammed into each other in the dark, snapping masts and crushing hulls. The unbreakable crescent formation shattered. The fireships actually didn't burn a single Spanish vessel, but they didn't need to. They achieved exactly what the English wanted: total chaos. When the sun rose, the English saw their masterpiece. The Armada was scattered, disorganized, and totally vulnerable. The floating fortress was gone. Now came the kill. The Battle of Gravelines. English ships darted in at point-blank range. They didn't fire from a distance anymore. They pulled up right alongside the isolated Spanish galleons and unleashed hell. But as the English pounded the Spanish hulls, ripping through wood and flesh, they noticed something incredibly bizarre. The massive, lethal cannons on the Spanish ships were barely firing back. Were the Spanish out of ammo? No. They had thousands of cannonballs sitting right on the deck. The problem was a catastrophic failure of military intelligence. Decades of modern archaeological dives into Armada shipwrecks revealed a shocking truth. The iron cannonballs manufactured in Spain were just fractions of an inch too large for the cannons. In the heat of battle, as Spanish gunners frantically tried to reload, the iron balls jammed in the barrels. Their primary weapons were completely useless. The greatest war machines in the world were reduced to sitting ducks. English cannons shredded the Spanish decks. Blood literally flowed out of the scuppers into the sea. Over 1,000 Spanish sailors were killed or wounded. The English suffered fewer than 100 casualties. It was an absolute slaughter, but just when total annihilation seemed certain, another massive twist of fate altered the course of history. The English suddenly stopped firing. They hadn't won. They had simply run completely out of gunpowder. With the English guns falling silent, a sudden, fierce squall picked up from the south. The battered, bleeding remnants of the Spanish Armada were pushed northward, away from the invasion rendezvous, away from the English guns, and into the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Sea. They had survived the battle, but what awaited them in the dark, violent waters around Scotland and Ireland would make the English cannons look like a mercy. Pushed into the freezing expanse of the North Sea, the Duke of Medina Sidonia faced an impossible reality. The invasion was dead. The English fleet, though totally out of gunpowder, was still trailing them, effectively blocking the English Channel. Going back the way they came was suicide. So the Duke made the only call he could. The Armada would have to sail all the way around the rugged, treacherous coastlines of Scotland and Ireland just to get back home. It was supposed to be a grueling but manageable detour. Instead, it became one of the most horrific maritime nightmares in human history. As the fleet rounded the northern tip of Scotland, they sailed directly into the teeth of the worst Atlantic storm season of the 16th century. These galleons were already bleeding from English cannon fire. Their hulls were splintered and their rigging was in tatters. Now, they were being battered by hurricane-force winds and monstrous waves. The Spanish sailors were entirely out of food and fresh water. Desperate men resorted to eating rats, chewing on leather, and drinking their own urine as typhus and dysentery tore through the cramped decks. Ships began to take on water faster than it could be bailed out. One by one, the massive, floating fortresses of the Spanish Golden Age simply vanished beneath the freezing black waves. But the true horror awaited those who were pushed toward the jagged, unforgiving coastline of Western Ireland. Blinded by the storms, dozens of Spanish captains miscalculated their positions. Massive galleons violently smashed into the rocky cliffs. Thousands of men drowned in the roaring surf, and those who miraculously survived the shipwrecks and washed ashore found no mercy. English commanders stationed in Ireland, terrified of a Catholic uprising, ordered the immediate execution of any Spanish survivor. Thousands of exhausted, freezing men were hunted down on the beaches and slaughtered or stripped of their clothes and left to die of exposure. By the time the shattered remnants of the great and most fortunate navy finally limped back into Spanish ports in the fall of 1588, the death toll was incomprehensible. Nearly half the fleet was gone. Up to 20,000 men were dead. Only a tiny fraction of those casualties were from English cannons. The vast majority were claimed by starvation, disease, and the merciless Atlantic. For centuries, British propaganda has framed this apocalyptic weather as the Protestant wind, a literal act of God blowing away the enemies of England. It gave birth to the ultimate national myth, that the scrappy English underdog instantly became the undisputed master of the oceans, kicking off the global British Empire. But this is where history pulls its ultimate, devastating bait and switch. Because the truth about what happened to the English in the immediate aftermath is a carefully buried national embarrassment. You would think the victorious English sailors returned to London as conquering heroes, showered with gold and eternal glory. They did not. Instead, they returned to a bankrupt, paranoid government. Queen Elizabeth I simply didn't have the money to pay the men who had just saved her kingdom. To avoid paying their wages, she ordered the sailors to remain aboard their filthy, disease-ridden ships in port. Typhus and dysentery swept through the English ranks with terrifying speed. The men who had stared down the greatest war machine on earth began dying in the streets of coastal towns, begging for food. In the weeks following the battle, more English sailors died of disease and starvation than the Spanish lost to English cannons during the entire engagement. And the myth of instant British naval supremacy? That is completely shattered by the events of the very next year. In 1589, high on the fumes of survival, Elizabeth ordered Sir Francis Drake to launch the English Armada. She sent a massive fleet of her own to the Iberian coast, aiming to destroy the remaining Spanish ships, spark a rebellion in Portugal, and completely cripple Philip's transatlantic trade. It was supposed to be the final death blow to the Spanish Empire. Instead, it was a catastrophe of identical proportions. Drake's fleet was devastated by a combination of fierce Spanish resistance, catastrophic logistical failures, and rampant disease. The English lost thousands of men and dozens of ships. They returned home utterly defeated and completely broke. The stunning reality is that the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 did not end the Anglo-Spanish War. It didn't even come close. The war ground on for another grueling 16 years. King Philip II didn't surrender. He learned. He completely overhauled his navy, building faster, deadlier ships, and the Spanish Empire actually tightened its grip on the oceans, remaining the world's dominant superpower for another century. When a peace treaty was finally signed in 1604, it wasn't a triumphant British victory. It was a mutual surrender to exhaustion. The borders remained virtually unchanged. The story of the Spanish Armada isn't a simple, heroic tale of good versus evil, or of destiny magically handing the oceans to the British Empire. It is a terrifying testament to the brutal realities of 16th century warfare. It is a story of catastrophic intelligence failures, royal hubris, and an arrogant reliance on divine intervention that sent tens of thousands of men into a senseless meat grinder. But above all, it proves the sheer power of a well-crafted myth. The reality of Gravelines, the jammed cannons, the slaughtered sailors, the starving victors, was slowly paved over. In its place, a legendary narrative was forged. A myth so powerful, so emotionally resonant, that it gave a fractured island nation the absolute conviction to eventually build an empire that would, centuries later, actually rule the waves. The Spanish Armada didn't create the British Empire in a single, fiery battle. But the myth they built out of its ashes did. That sheer power of a well-crafted myth is exactly why history is so dangerous and so fascinating. The ashes of the Spanish Armada birthed an empire of lies that survived for centuries, effectively masking the brutal reality of starving victors, bankrupt governments, and senseless slaughter. It forces you to stop and ask, how many other historical facts that we accept as absolute truth today are just centuries-old, well-packaged propaganda? History is overflowing with these carefully buried national embarrassments. The legendary heroes are rarely spotless, the infamous villains are rarely one-dimensional, and the official narratives passed down through generations are almost always designed to hide a much darker, much more complex reality. Kings, queens, and sprawling empires have spent unimaginable fortunes and sacrificed millions of human lives just to control the story you read in your history textbooks. But those official narratives are finally cracking. Here, we do not settle for the sanitized fairy tale version of human events. We dig directly into the jammed cannons, the hidden catastrophic failures, and the deeply inconvenient truths that powerful empires tried desperately to erase from the archives. We dismantle these global myths piece by piece to show you exactly how the modern world was actually forged, not by destiny or divine intervention, but by blood, royal arrogance, devastating human cost, and massive political cover-ups. If you refuse to be fed comfortable lies, and you want to uncover the raw, unfiltered reality of our past, hit the subscribe button right now. Join this community of relentless truth seekers as we tear down the next great historical illusion. In our upcoming videos, we are pulling back the curtain on more legendary events that are entirely different from everything you were taught in school. Do not let history's greatest cover-ups remain buried in the dark. Click subscribe and step out of the myth and into the undeniable truth.